Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the screenwriter and novelist Jed Mercurio.
We spoke to Jed about moving from the Air Force and medicine into writing, about working on novels as well as screenplays, and creating the hit police drama Line of Duty.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Jed, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with your early life? I read that you were interested in science fiction and you read Catcher in the Rye, things like that. And you were interested in literature as a youngster, but you never really wanted to be a writer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I went to a pretty ordinary comprehensive school, and really our horizons didn't extend to media careers. I didn't know anybody who'd followed that path. We weren't really encouraged towards it. And coming from a working class background, it felt that careers in the creative industries were off limits, that they were for people who came from more privileged backgrounds. So I kind of looked towards initially a scientific career and ended up going to medical school.
And can you tell us about your decision to join the Royal Air Force as well? Where did that fit into this?
I'd been interested in joining the military towards the end of my time in school, but ultimately I decided that the kind of career I wanted was something that was more scientific. But then when I was at medical school, I came across a specialisation of aviation medicine, which was really being led by the Royal Air Force. And I looked into it further, and I went to the RAF Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough and was really impressed with what they were doing there. And also there was an opportunity to get involved in flying. And I'd always wanted to be a pilot, but I didn't think there was a career that I would be particularly excited about. And this was one. So my ambition was to be what's called a medical officer pilot. So I would complete my medical education, but also I would learn to fly initially in the University Air Squadron, and then I would go into the Air Force proper to do my advanced flying training. And that was the path I went on.
And alongside your early interest in literature, were you a vociferous consumer of television and film as well?
I was much more interested in TV than literature, to be honest. I did English O-level, and I didn't do literature beyond that level. I kind of like for sort of pleasure, I read science fiction. I didn't really read very much more. And then yeah, it was absolutely TV that I remember as being the big influence all through my childhood and later in life as well.
Can you tell us about this advert in the British Medical Journal that you answered in the early 90s looking for doctors to consult on TV shows, and how the chain of events went from there?
Yeah, so by this point, I was working as a house officer in the NHS, although I was still in the Air Force. And once I finished my medical degree, I could have done medical practice in the Air Force, but they encourage you to do your house jobs in the NHS just because it was better training. And so I was doing that. And there was an advert in the back of the British Medical Journal really seeking advisors for a new medical drama in development that a production company was working on. And I suppose what kind of chimed with me about that was that I'd watched a lot of medical drama on TV, and possibly there was even an argument that I'd been influenced towards a medical career by what I'd seen portrayed in medical dramas. It looked like a very exciting and rewarding job, and it is both of those things. But there's another side of medicine that isn't portrayed in medical dramas, and certainly wasn't being portrayed when I was at working in the NHS, and that is the darker side of the pressures on medical staff, and the pressures that really were severely burdening junior hospital doctors at that time. So my agenda with responding to the advert, if you could even call it an agenda, was just to give them an insight into how the medical dramas that were on TV at that time were completely missing the authenticity of what frontline hospital life was like.
So what did those plots of those medical procedurals sort of look like? Was it just a case of patient gets ill, doctor treats them, happy ending?
It wasn't so much that. It was how they portrayed the way medical staff interact, and the distinctions between junior hospital doctors, senior doctors, nurses, and allied professions. And I just kind of felt that in the mix of that, junior hospital doctors were not being represented. That if you worked in hospitals in the NHS in the 90s, a considerable burden of the service responsibility landed on the shoulders of junior hospital doctors. And so I kind of watched a lot of shows that seemed rather outdated in terms of what the working hours were like, what the working patterns were like, what the interaction was like between juniors and seniors and between doctors and nurses and so forth. And I guess what I concluded was that the program makers were more influenced by previous works of medical fiction than they were by what was actually happening in British hospitals at that time.
And how did you go from applying for a job to consult to actually writing Cardiac Arrest? How did that sequence of events happen?
Yeah, that's one of the great mysteries of the universe. I kind of kept throwing in anecdotes to illustrate points and giving examples of what I meant in terms of how things were in the hospitals that I was working in. And I guess as part of that, I was trying to sell what those things would say about characters or the world that they were attempting to portray. And as experienced program makers, they must have recognized that what I was really doing was pitching stories. And so they came back to me and asked if I would storyline an episode, which I was happy to do. And that went sufficiently well that after some thought, they asked if I would consider drafting a script. And I'd never even written a script. So they had to show me the layout of a script and give me pointers about the absolute basics. But I kind of knew the story I wanted to tell, and that was helpful. And I knew the world I was attempting to portray, which is also very helpful. So I just dived in.
And you were still working as a doctor while this was happening, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I started writing the script during my second house job. Back then you did two house jobs, 6 months each. And I started during the second one. And and I was still working as a doctor. I was by then a senior house officer when the program aired.
I wrote a big series of medical articles for The Economist during the pandemic, and I remember speaking to one doctor who specifically mentioned your work as the sort of most realistic medical drama that he'd ever seen. And I think that's been a comment that's been repeated. I mean, what was the feedback that the show's producers started getting and you yourself when this went out? Was there a feeling from doctors that at last someone was showing it like it was?
Well, in terms of what the genuine reaction was of people I met and friends of friends, it was that. It was generally positive in terms of the authenticity of the portrayal. In terms of how it was portrayed in the media, there was a greater diversity of reaction that was being portrayed. So, of course, there would be people saying that it was accurate and representative and a step forward in terms of the representation of what's going on in the NHS. But there were people that either claimed to work in hospitals or were just people who wrote for newspapers who said something very different.
Sorry to dwell on the mechanics of it, but I think it's extraordinary that you were working as a doctor and doing this at the same time. And I saw that you produced one season a year, and the first season was 6 episodes, and then 8, and then 13. How much time did you have to work on each episode, and what was the process in terms of storylining, as you say, and then getting feedback from producers?
Yeah, I mean, with the first series, as you know, development takes as long as it takes. You're not really working to deadlines. So that took a considerable period of time. I started writing it in early 1992, and then we filmed it late 1993. And that was the 6-episode first season. When it got recommissioned, then things got a bit tighter. And so we were commissioned for more episodes, and there was a delivery date so that we could have the second season on air the following year. So that was the point really where I had some big decisions to make. And I stopped studying for my postgraduate exams to focus on writing the scripts. And then actually when we started filming the series, I had my last stab at a career in aviation medicine. I'd come out of the Air Force by that point because the pathway to being a medical officer pilot had been closed off due to defence cuts. But the Army Air Corps still had an active program, and that summer of 1994, I went into the Army Air Corps and did some flying with them and passed the flying course. And I actually had my final interview while we were shooting season 2, at which they said they were cutting back their program. So I kind of realised that maybe writing for TV, which it seemed like a bit of a blip, a bit of a diversion from my true path, might become more significant in my life. So that was why I really threw myself into it. So when we did season 3, which was 13, I was a full-time writer.
A big theme that often comes up when we have screenwriters on the show is this difference between the kind of individual solo writer model, or in some ways perhaps the English model, and the showrunner or US model. And is it right that on these early projects you were solo writing? And then how has that worked subsequently through your career? And what are your thoughts about the relative merits of those two different approaches?
With Cardiac Arrest, there was definitely a feeling for the first season that it was an experiment giving me this opportunity. And so I wrote the first script, and then I started work on the second. And there was still a lot of talk about bringing other writers in. But I kept delivering, and I kept finding storylines they liked. And so I was lucky enough that I ended up writing the whole of the first season. And really from that point forward, everybody was quite comfortable with me writing whole seasons. And so when I create shows, one of the considerations has to be whether it will be a show that I write entirely on my own, or it's something where I'll be seeking co-writers. You know, if the episode order is long, or it's quite episodic rather than serialized. So that ends up being the calculation for me on the serial dramas that I've done since. I've tended to write solo just because the stories are so interconnected that it's really hard to get them all storylined and then separated out and have writers writing in parallel and not end up with too rigid a format, so that you can't change things, you can't go back and move things around, and you're also tied into storylining as a group, which can be great fun, and I've done that. But that's been on shows where the principle has been that the best results will come from having multiple writers writing individual episodes.
And it sounds like you were able to sort of learn on the job on Cardiac Arrest. And I read that you went back later and did screenwriting workshops, weekend courses, read the books and stuff. What made you want to do that, given you already had that practical experience?
Well, I came from a background where you learned how to do things by following technical guidance. That I would never consider that there was something instinctive or intuitive about how you learn medicine, or something entirely subjective about how you fly an aeroplane.
It'd be quite worrying if that was people's approach.
Yeah. So obviously both of those things involved aptitude, but there's also a huge amount of technical know-how, which gives you the framework in which to demonstrate your aptitude. So it kind of felt to me that I was being told things about writing technique that made a lot of sense, and so because I'd had that helpful guidance in what you might call an apprenticeship type setting, I thought it would be really interesting to seek out other opportunities to learn. So reading screenwriting theory, going to workshops and hearing people talk about how you approach screenwriting, the techniques for story building, and the way in which you can become analytical of your own work. And I found that really helpful, because it allowed me to start understanding the building blocks of structure.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it's interacted with people's writing lives, and be as candid or as guarded as you're comfortable with. But when you'd made this kind of radical career shift from a military career to writing for TV, at what stage were you able to kind of earn a living off it, and how did that aspect work?
Yeah, I was pretty lucky in that I was able to earn a living straight away, because when I started, I was working full time in the NHS and earning a junior doctor's income, and before that I was receiving an RAF officer's pay. So I was coming out of medical education without being really burdened by loans and some of the things that would afflict people now. And I got a full grant to go through medical school as well. So although I came from a working class background and we didn't have family money and I didn't inherit any money, I started earning, and also had relatively low outgoings. I didn't have any dependents. I was living in rented accommodation. So it was actually quite a comfortable decision for me to make. And because I'd had success early in my career as well, it meant that I could live within my means. And I always thought that if the work dried up, that I could do locum medical practice and I could earn. So I never really worried about that. So it was always there for me as a fallback if I needed it. So I was very fortunate that over the early part of my career, I got commissioned to write, and I had enough work produced that living a fairly modest life, I was okay financially.
And how did Bodies come about in 2002, your debut novel? What made you decide to write in a different mode?
Well, after Cardiac Arrest finished, I'd kind of learned a little bit more by then about the commissioning process. I was completely naive about TV drama commissioning when I first started. And when the series ended, I kind of was looking to generate new projects, which I did. But then I wanted to go back to write about medicine again. And that was the point where I became quite frustrated with the commissioning process, that I started developing a series for a broadcaster, and pretty much every meeting we had, they were changing the commission. They were changing what they were looking for based on the performance of some other series or a change of personnel at the broadcaster. And I just, in the end, found it a very frustrating process, that I wasn't in a position where I was getting to write the idea I wanted to write, which was really what I'd been very fortunate to be able to do with Cardiac Arrest. And I just had this idea that I wanted to write, and I didn't have an outlet for it. So I wrote it as a novel.
We really love, again on the show, to get into the mechanics of people's first first books and how it worked in terms of an agent and a deal and things like that. So with that, again, this second gear shift you make from writing scripts to writing prose fiction, how did you go about getting that published?
I had help from my TV agent, who put me in contact with a number of literary agents. So I met with a few of those and was lucky enough to find a literary agent who liked the sample chapters that I'd written for the book. And I did some more work on the sample chapters and a pitch document for the book itself. And then we took that to market. We sent it to, I think, 10 publishers and ended up having follow-up with 3. And out of that follow-up, there was only really one publisher who wanted the book to be what I wanted to write. So one of the things that I kind of realized then was that there were more places you could take a novel than you could take a TV series. And I know now there are the streaming platforms, and there are more homes for your work if you are writing TV scripts. But back then, there were fewer channels, and often, given what the idea was, there might only be 1 or 2 channels who would even be interested in it. So if they said no, that was the end of your opportunity to have that work see the light of day. So that was something that was really helpful to me, to know that if there were stories I wanted to tell that wouldn't fit with the commissioning landscape in television, that I could pursue them as novels.
I guess to sort of reverse engineered it, because Bodies was then adapted into a show. Did you find that edifying, that there was in fact a market for it, or frustrating?
I was just very grateful for the opportunity. I reached a point in my career where I wanted to do drama and do something that was more mature and harder hitting than I'd done before. And I was worried that I wasn't going to get that chance. And so the fact that the novel was optioned and a broadcaster showed interest and we started on a development process was something that I was really excited about, because I was sort of at the point of my career then when there was a worry that I might be drifting away from television, and not because I wanted to. I love TV and I wanted to stay working in TV, but writers' careers sometimes come to an end if you fall out of favour with the broadcasters, if the commissioners' tastes change and they're not fans of your work, then you can very easily find yourself on the outside of the industry.
Could you tell us about Ascent, your novel about a Soviet pilot turned cosmonaut? And I was wondering if, clearly this rift on your earlier career in the Air Force, but were you also conscious of a sort of broader tradition of aviation literature, of the Right Stuff or of James Salter or writers in that vein? Were they influences as well?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I loved the Right Stuff and I loved Salter's novel, The Hunters. And so when I thought about what I wanted to do next after Bodies, there were a number of ideas I was talking to my publisher about, but this was the standout idea. I just really wanted to write something that allowed me to write about the primary experience of aviation that I'd had, and write about the full sensory input that you get from military flying. So I guess in a way I did it just because I thought I'd really enjoy it. And I have to say it was probably the most enjoyable writing experience I've ever had. Not that I haven't had lots of enjoyable writing experiences, but just to completely fall into that world and to do the research alongside digging into my own memories of flying was just great fun.
When you do research, is that a case of doing it before you start writing, or are you doing it alongside actually putting words on the page?
I tend to do it alongside. I might do some initial research just to make sure that if something is set in the real world, that I know enough for it to be authentic seeming and for it to be plausible. But beyond that, then the writing leads the research rather than the research leads the writing.
And had you flown jets yourself, or was that a kind of thing that you had to research as well?
Yeah, I'd flown Hawks in the Air Force. So I kind of based the experiences of flying Korean War jets on my own personal experience of flying Hawks, and then just did the necessary research about the differences. But the fundamental experience of flying a fast jet is the same. It's about accuracy of your flying and G-forces, and I'd done dogfighting maneuvers. So again, I was familiar with the sensory experience of doing the maneuvers that are described in the book.
Simon has a lot of military interests, so can see his eyes lighting up while you're describing this.
Have you done any flying?
Well, I spent a year in the army before university, and then I read a book about the army as well. And I've written some big magazine pieces about plane crashes as well. But I think in the interests of our general listenership, we should not have a kind of geek off about aviation, much as I would like to.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the screenwriter Jed Mercurio. It's time for the next instalment of our segment where we share bonus material from previous guests of the show. So this week we're going to hear from the chair of Virago Press, Lenny Goodings, and she's going to tell you about a piece of advice she wishes she'd had at the start of her career.
I would say it's very much tied up with the advice I think I'd like to have been given when I was 25 when I came to London for the first time. And I had the idea, I came to London from Canada, and I had the idea that I was going to just stay for 1 year and do anything and then go home and get a proper job. And I don't know if I would have listened to this advice, but I think I kind of wish I'd known a little bit better that whatever you do in your 20s, early 20s, sort of sets the course for your life. And I didn't realize. And we published a wonderful writer called Sybil Bedford. The novel's called A Compass Error. And she's very old and she's being interviewed by somebody who says, something about her life. And she says, you know what, I thought what I was doing was a rehearsal. And then I turned around and the curtain was up and it was real life. And I slightly feel that. But I'm not sure I would have listened. If somebody had said to me, look, it's just a rehearsal, I would have said, I don't care. I'm still going. But I wish I'd had a little bit more knowledge of that.
That was Lenny Goodings. And if you were interested in what Lenny had to say, you can listen to our full interview with her via our website, which is www.alwaystakenotes.com. But for now, back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Jed Mercurio.
I wanted to jump ahead now, actually, to Line of Duty. Obviously, there's many seasons of it, lots and lots of characters, lots of plot lines. I read in an interview that there is a master paragraph somewhere where you'd outlined the entire narrative before the first season came out. Is that true, or is that a bit of an urban legend?
Who was that an interview with? With me?
Apparently, yeah. I mean, it came up in my research, but maybe it's erroneous.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was a plan about how we would continue the series after season one. For people who are familiar with season one, it's not entirely apparent how it would be returnable, and so there was absolutely a document which made it clear to the BBC that there was a way the show could return and it could build from that first season. But it didn't have a huge amount of detail. It didn't plot out a multi-season arc. And then as we got further into it, as we did 2, 3, 4 seasons, then we started to talk about what each season might achieve in terms of the meta-narrative. But those were the absolute broadest strokes, and that tended to be season by season.
And what was it like in terms of process, but also in terms of the experience of taking on another institution? You'd written extensively about medicine, which you'd been within yourself, and then taking on law enforcement and getting into and under the skin of that world. How did that piece work?
Yeah, I think it's a useful lesson for writers about the transferability of skills, or more accurately, the transferability of experience. That there's an idea that you have to write about what you know, but if you've done one particular kind of job and had a very particular kind of experience of a specific institution, often there will be similarities with parallel institutions, and so that you can exploit that knowledge. And so, having worked in the NHS and the military, I felt I had an instinct about how things might work in the police. And so then it was a case of doing the most basic research about how things might happen that would make the story plausible. The idea of an anti-corruption unit, the way in which they go about their work, and so on. That was the most superficial kind of research. And once I got to the point of realizing that would be a plausible social realist drama, then it was more a case of researching any specifics as we continued the process.
Was that a case of reaching out to police officers and interviewing them and asking them about it, or was it just stuff that you could find sort of in the public domain?
We tried to do both. We did meet with some police officers, but that ended up being shut down fairly quickly. So we met a couple of retired officers who were prepared to give us a very sketchy insight. They were very cautious about what they would tell us. We met with a serving anti-corruption officer in the Met who was very keen to help us, and then was ordered not to. And then we just did online research, read books that were written anonymously by police officers, blogs that were written anonymously by police officers. So that was season one. Then once the show went out, we got some serving officers to be advisors. They reached out and agreed to help us anonymously, and that then allowed us to really open the show out and to deal in much more detail with the world of anti-corruption policing.
Did you feel that you were encountering the same phenomenon you had at the beginning of your career, that there was an existing genre of police procedural, just as there had been an existing genre of medical procedural that had a tendentious relationship to reality, and that you could kind of plough the same furrow, that you could try and produce something that was grittier and more real?
I think that's a good point, yeah. And I wouldn't necessarily claim that that's what happened, but when I first started, I worked with Tony Garnett. He was involved in Cardiac Arrest as an executive producer, and the very early days of Line of Duty, Tony was involved as an exec producer. And he was someone who used the expression the drama of reassurance to describe most mainstream procedurals. And he was interested in dramas that broke that mold, that looked at what happens when institutions become self-protective and they reach that point where they're more interested in advancing their own reputation and protecting their own reputation than they are about doing the job that they're expected to do in serving the public. So being familiar with that in the medical world and writing about it was something that sort of chimed with Tony's history. But I honestly didn't go about it deliberately with Cardiac Arrest. I was honestly and naively attempting to represent the world as I was experiencing it. As I did more work on that series, I suppose I began to realize that the more interesting episodes and the more revisionist episodes of the genre were ones where we looked at things going wrong, which obviously does happen in hospitals. Although my experience of being a doctor was balanced, I think there were lots and lots of positives as well as the negatives. As the series went on, we were focusing more on the negatives and finding drama in that. And that was something that was then really maximized in Bodies, which was about a failing unit. There was no balance there. This was a unit that was dangerous and negligent. And sadly, that does exist in the real world, and it continues to exist. The reviews of failings and harm caused by certain obstetric units in the UK that are carried out in the present day find exactly the same problems that existed 20 years ago when Body was being written. So with the police, it was just a similar idea, which is look for how an institution defines itself by how it deals with things going wrong.
I was just thinking what the opposite of a drama of reassurance would be, and I'm going to volunteer drama of perturbance. I also saw in an interview that when it came to working out the sort of season arc for Line of Duty, the main thing you'd focus on is the anti-hero. Could you talk about that idea, if that is indeed correct?
It is correct. We actually called that character the antagonist. So that's the guest lead character in each season. This was part of the original pitch about the returnability of the series, that the character in season 1, DCI Tony Gates, played by Lenny James, was a character who didn't continue into season 2. And so the pitch was the anti-corruption unit AC-12 would investigate a new character, a police officer who was accused of some form of misconduct. And so the obvious question is, who is that character and what have they done? You know, the very basic thing of like, what's the crime and how is it solved? Who's the villain and what's their plan? So in that sense, we were following that model of how you construct a crime story or a thriller story. And what we learned, of course, is that it's something that if you are fortunate enough, allows the show to grow, because each season there's a fresh story, which means that a new audience can join the show and they're seeing things that the loyal audience hasn't seen before. So everybody is if they like what they're watching, feels like they're on the same journey. And it's only later in the series that we start looking back at legacy stories and rewarding the loyal viewers. But also by then, the foreground story is still the brand new story and the arc of that season's antagonist.
Just taking a slightly different tack, could you tell us about what your sort of professional business setup as a writer is now and where Hattrick Mercurio sits into that? So do you have your own operation, and how big is it? And you know, just for people who maybe aren't familiar with how this works in TV, how does that whole machine work?
I think I've got parallel careers. So I still freelance as a writer outside of my own company. And that's something I really enjoy. And Line of Duty and Bodyguard, for example, lay outside of my relationship with HTM Television. And HTM was something that we set up because I knew a lot of writers and I knew a lot of emerging writers, and I wanted to find a way that process of collaboration could actually lead to television output. So, for example, our first production, Bloodlands, was a spec script written by a brand new writer. And ordinarily, that might be something where someone might reach out and say, would you mind reading this script and giving me any tips? Whereas when I read this script and really enjoyed it, I was able to develop it within the infrastructure of HTM and make it a brand new TV series.
And in terms of some of your other projects that you've done, I was interested that you adapted Lady Chatterley's Lover, you've done a graphic novel. How do you see that fitting into the kind of general arc of your career? Is it just a case that you were interested in these projects and you wanted to pursue them?
Yeah, there's a thing they say about kind of like the difference between characters and real life, which is in real life people don't have arcs. And because I work in real life, I don't feel I've got an arc. I just sort of do what I really want to do. Whether that turns out to be the right decision or not is pretty random, to be honest. You just never know. But generally, I'm motivated by being really interested in the work and feeling that I would enjoy it, I would bring something to it, and the result would be something that I would want to watch as a fan. So generally, that's what motivates me.
What do you think of this idea of peak TV that is sometimes talks about, that the influx of streaming services and these huge amounts of money have created some really wonderful work, but perhaps almost created a glut, and there's been a lot of show cancellations recently and things. What do you think as someone who's ridden this wave from, as you say, from terrestrial broadcasting to where we are now, of what the current situation is and where it will go from here?
Yeah, I think that we're obviously very grateful if we work in content creation that there are more places you can take your work. But commissioning is its own its own ecosystem, and the fact is that ultimately commissioners decide subjectively and use their own discretion to decide which projects get picked up, how they're packaged, maybe how they're realised, and then whether they're renewed. And that's always been the same. So we're just seeing this play out across more platforms. But if you go back 20 odd years before the streaming revolution, you would see plenty of shows that did well being cancelled, and you would see plenty of shows that weren't really doing very well staying on the air for a long time. And that's down to the discretion of the commissioners. And it's obviously a wider conversation about why those things happen.
Do you think streaming has changed the nature of storytelling in any meaningful way? In the fact that viewers can binge lots of episodes at once, do you think that's had an effect on the way that a story is actually constructed?
I think it's had a bigger effect on commissioning. That when I started writing, I wrote assuming that the audience we were attempting to reach was the kind of TV viewer I was, which is if I liked a TV program, then I watched as many episodes of it as I could, and I tried to follow it as closely as I could so that I would understand week on week what the story was and who the characters were, and be able to follow the intricacies and nuances of the story. And when I started working in TV, I met a lot of people who were involved in commissioning who told me that people don't even pay attention to the TV. That I remember one person saying, "Oh, you've got to remember that they're watching the TV doing the ironing, and so don't try to be too detailed. Don't rely on people having watched the previous episode," and so on. And that became quite a big thing in, certain controllers and commissioners were adamant that people didn't watch TV very closely, and therefore if you were trying to tell a complex story, it wouldn't find an audience. And they were the gatekeepers. They were rejecting those shows so they weren't getting on the air. What the streaming revolution has achieved is made it clear that there are plenty of people who enjoy TV and love TV as much as the people who make it, and they want to immerse themselves in a show they love, and they are familiar with the intricacies of the story, and they can recognize the character from one episode to the next. So the data that's come out from the streaming revolution has convinced commissioners of something that writers like me have known all along, which is that you can have a very successful relationship with the audience, even if you're telling quite complex stories.
You've had some fairly antagonistic interactions with journalists in interviews and on social media. What is, from your side, the experience of having your work kind of written about like? And are there any commentators you feel have engaged particularly thoughtfully with the stuff you've worked on?
Oh, sure, of course. There plenty's written about my work that's flattering, and that's great. I think generally when I've chosen to engage, it's been over matters of fact or occasionally over attitudes that I just have a problem with. But it's a very difficult thing to talk about because the people who end up writing about what I'm supposed to have said and what I'm supposed to have done are other journalists. And so it's pretty clear whose side they're on, and they will distort what I'm supposed to have said and supposed to have done to make me seem like I'm picking on some poor defenseless journalist who never said boo to a goose. And they'll also just straight out lie about what I've said and done. So it's kind of, you just end up having to kind of distance yourself from that whole interaction, which is what I've done, in the last couple of years, having had experiences where journalists have just flat out lied about what I've said in an interview. I've just given up.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wondered if you could tell us about some of the projects you're working on at the minute, and whether there's a project that you that are not actively working on but you hope to realise in the future.
Yeah, well, we're really busy at HTM. We shot a series called Payback, which is a brand new thriller series that's going to be on air later this year. We're currently shooting the second season of Trigger Point. In fact, I was on the set, and that is something that is a really exciting show that we're very proud of, and we're going to build on the amazing success of season one. And it's just a delight working with Vicky McClure again. And then later in the year, there'll be something new that hasn't been announced yet, which is the first thing I've written myself for British TV for a little while. And hopefully we'll be able to announce that fairly soon.
Could you tell us a bit about your writing routine? I saw that you keep office hours that it looks like it's kind of quite structured from your side. How does it work, firstly, and how is that important for you and for your process?
I keep the hours that I need to keep in order to do the work. So when we're in production, for example, I'm really led by what the shooting hours are. As a showrunner, I've got to be on the set. I've got to be in the edit. So my writing is something that's just got to fit into the gaps. I've got to maybe leave the set to go somewhere quiet, or if we're on a nice big set with loads of space, I can normally find a quiet corner and do some writing if I need to. But if I'm just in a total writing phase where there's no production commitment at all, then generally I like to work during the day, and as long as I achieve enough in a week, then I don't really beat myself up. I think as writers, you have good days and bad days, and I think setting yourself the target of working for so many hours in a day or achieving so many pages of output in a day is something I've just never done. I just kind of accept that it will vary, and as long as I stay roughly on schedule week by week, then I'm comfortable with that.
Thanks very much, Jed. That was brilliant, and wishing you all the very best with all of your ventures going forward.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Jed Mercurio. He's on Twitter at Jed_Mercurio, and his production company is on Twitter at HTM Television. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the conversation with Jed?
We were so pleased to get Jed on the show because I think he's been another one that we've been looking to interview for a while, especially with my interest in screenwriting, and given how big Line of Duty and Bodyguard both were, it was great to hear about how those shows were put together. And I hadn't really realised until doing the research as well that he'd written novels and then sort of reverse engineered them into TV shows again. So I thought all of that in terms of the research and also the showrunner versus writer's room sort of model as well, and how that's worked for him. It was great to get into all of that. How about you?
Yeah, definitely another white whale of Always Take Notes. So it was excellent to land him. I was very excited to talk to someone almost as interested as me in novels about mid-20th century aviation, although I think you correctly, for the sake of a general interest podcast, reeled us in. I thought it was very interesting, and someone who's had a kind of unusual route in, and then also, this is a perennial thing we always say, but to get a readout from someone who's been at the heart of a big cultural moment, be it a book or a TV series or something like that. Line of Duty is a very well-known show in the UK. So I thought, again, a real privilege to hear from that. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
I'm still trying to organise this trip that I mentioned a couple of episodes ago. So I've been doing some sort of classic journalistic wrangling for Access, working on a couple of book reviews, that kind of thing. How about you, Simon? You're back in the UK finally. I'm back in the
UK, which is very exciting. I came back just over a week ago. It's been good. I was very exhausted when I came back, and I've had to. We've had a bit of work related to the podcast we had to do, and I've got 1.5 more deadlines to meet, and then I'm hopefully taking a bit of time off. So it's very nice to be back, but it does feel a little bit surreal. And I also realised that I didn't realise it was summer. My sense of the seasons had all sort of fallen out because I wasn't here for an English winter really. So I sort of thought
it's not really summer yet, though. It did rain all weekend, so
it did rain all weekend. Yeah. So a little bit out of kilter, and looking forward to having a bit of time off. But anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb,
and me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.